Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the first Homosexuals Symposium presented in conjunction with the exhibition, The First Homosexuals, The Birth of a New Identity, 1869 to 1939, currently at Wrightwood 659, here in Chicago through July 26th. I am Chirag Bedlani, Executive Director of Alphawood Foundation Chicago. We are a private foundation working toward a just, humane, and equitable society. Through Alphawood Exhibitions, we work to present socially engaged art and architecture exhibitions at Wrightwood 659, including The First Homosexuals, and including, I saw Patrick McCoy here, Patrick McCoy, take my picture in 2023. We are so proud of this exhibition, which opened last week. I know many of you had the chance to go today or will go tomorrow, but if you have not yet had a chance, please plan your visit and join us for what I think is an overwhelming experience. The sheer number of queer works of art assembled in one place and celebrated at a time of increasing homophobia and transphobia is deeply moving. I want to thank our staff at Wrightwood 659 who helped make this exhibition happen, and a special thanks to Johnny Willis, Associate Curator. And Ashley Yankee, who's also here today. And also thank our lenders who entrusted us with their works to tell this story. We will have programs throughout the run of the show, including a film series at Facets every Wednesday in June, showing some of the earliest queer films. So please join us for that if you are in town. We are thrilled at the turnout for today's symposium, and we have an incredible cohort of scholars here who have come together to explore the richness of the queer art histories brought to life in this exhibition. Thank you to everyone who joined us from near and far. Thank you also to Jean St. Alvin for all of your work to make this event happen, and to our partner, the Alliance Française. We say yes. So I have the pleasure of introducing Jonathan D. Katz. Jonathan serves as the curator of this exhibition and editor of the incredible exhibition catalog, which we publish with our publishing partner, Monticelli. And there's a sample outside. It's available for pre-order. So Jonathan's work on the exhibition and the catalog is in addition to his day job as professor of practice in art history and gender, sexuality, and women's studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and his real day job, which I would submit of that of activist. So it's this latter title that I want to pay tribute to. Jonathan was an activist in the early 1980s here in Chicago when he was co-chair as a graduate student of the Gay and Lesbian Town Meeting, a grassroots network of gays and lesbians which organized after the Archdiocese of Chicago worked to defeat an LGBT human rights ordinance. Jonathan was an activist as HIV and AIDS emerged as a deadly virus and quickly ravaged our community here in Chicago, in San Francisco, and nationally. He fought in the face of total government inaction, the echoes of which we are seeing today as HIV-related NIH, CDC, and PEPFAR grants are being slashed. Jonathan was an activist as academic and cultural institutions shunned queer art and queer scholarship, founding the first queer studies program in the United States and finding ways to exhibit queer art and art emerging out of the HIV epidemic when institutions rejected such shows out of, at best, indifference or lack of vision, or at worst, homophobia. It was during this fight when we started Alphawood Exhibitions to bring Jonathan Show Art AIDS America to Chicago in 2016. And Jonathan remains an activist, pursuing the enormous undertaking that is this exhibition, over 300 works from over 100 lenders, amidst global disruptions in shipping and politics, including the systemic attempt to erase trans people in America. A fearless show about queerness was the headline in Sunday's Chicago Sun-Times. Something only an activist could achieve. Alphawood and Wrightwood 659's founder, Fred Eichner, says in the foreword to the catalog, "I consider Jonathan one of the true heroes of LGBTQ liberation." Well, we are all in need of LGBTQ heroes right now, and we are fortunate to see his vision come to life with the first homosexuals. So with that, I give you Jonathan D.
Just a quick note that I'm going to be referencing work that comes from the many scholars who joined me in this project. And I'm not going to be referencing by name because so much of what I'm going to say, thank you, dear, is actually derived from their work. So the proper credit is in the publication, and I'm not going to bore you with it now, but I will say this, that this was a collective effort on the part of a great number of absolutely stupendous scholars, and to them especially I dedicate this talk and my gratitude for making the exhibition what it is.
Oh.
Okay. So, it's surprisingly difficult to imagine our identity without including sexuality. Not without sex, which is a very different thing, but rather absent a conception of desire categorized according to our now familiar homo-hetero-binary. Yet before the middle of the 19th century, sex was adjudged licit or illicit, legal or illegal, moral or sinful. But it was not locked into a permanent category according to the gender of the other or others involved. More important, sex was not yet taken to catalyze a whole series of character traits, manners, and psychic constructs seemingly far removed from the sex act itself. In other words, sex had yet to yield a sexuality. Before the middle of the 19th century, there were, of course, plenty of familiar associations to, for example, male effeminacy or female masculinity. But these traits were deemed separate from the sex act itself. Captain Whiffle, for example, a memorable character in the English writer Tobias Smollett's 1748 novel, The Adventures of Roderick Random, is described in appearance, dress, and manners as what we would call a queen, no doubt. Smollett styles the captain very particularly as he first boards the ship and takes command, and I'm quoting Smollett here, being a tall, thin young man dressed in a white hat garnished with a red feather atop his head, from which his hair flowed down upon his shoulders in ringlets tied behind with a ribbon, his coat of pinks-colored silk lined with white, by the elegance of its cut retired backwards to discover a white satin waistcoat embroidered with gold, unbuttoned at the upper part to display a brooch set with garnets, etc., etc., etc. In other words, right, he's hardly the normative British naval captain. But the fact that there were certain types associated with non-normative gender and even same-sex erotics was very different from suggesting that every act of same-sex sexuality fell under that polarity that we today term sexuality. Sure, queens like Captain Whiffle were assumed to like men, but that didn't suggest anything about men who were of a more normative masculinity. For this definitional categorizing was still about gender and gender roles, not about sexuality per se. Indeed, because gender norms generally predate sexuality, we often confuse gender with sexuality in normative discourse. In most world cultures, gender was operative in a way that sexuality was not. Catlin here gives you an image of exactly what I'm talking about, because many indigenous cultures had a space for a third sex, for men and women who contravened the society's gender norm. And this is, of course, Catlin's wonderful work. I'm very thrilled that we were able to pull this from the Smithsonian for the exhibition, which shows what, in the language of the period, is called dance to the berdache, to the two-spirited individual. That these individuals often had sexual relations with others of their own sex, but not of their gender, was again a function of gender, not sexuality. And yet, in other cultures, even gender wasn't an operative distinction between people until colonialism made it so, rewriting local customs in its own image. In this portrait of the Burmese royal family from the late 1800s, gender is unmarked sartorially in hairstyles or in any other manner. Indeed, ample historical sources testify to the fact that same-sex sex was often so normative and familiar that it didn't merit much attention at all and more significantly still, did not lock one onto one particular erotic path, nor predict future sexual acts. Same-sex sexuality and different-sex sexuality freely commingle in individual experiences, especially in eras in which female virginity was especially prized. Queer historian Martin Dubin, for example, discovered one early 18th century cachet of letters from the American South penned by what were actually early architects of slavery in the United States. These entitled sons of plantation life, then in their late teens, are shockingly graphic, as one asks about a mutual friend who had visited the night before, saying in the letter, "I trust he did not sleep as you prod him with your flesh and pole all night long," end quote. But as they age, the letters turn seamlessly into addresses to girlfriends, to wives, children, and ultimately to the preservation of the institution of slavery. Clearly, there is no progressive agenda at stake. But because sex did not yet equal a sexuality, people such as our conservative white supremacists were free to dip in and out of same-sex relations at no danger to their social normativity. Moreover, the very definition of same-sex sexuality was often quite fungible. For example, we know that as late as the 1920s in the United States, only the sexual partner who was understood as acting in opposition to their gender was understood and deemed a queer in the parlance of the time. But his or her chosen partner, though acting in accordance with the norms of their gender, was not queer and remained entirely unmarked by their choice of sexual partner. For example, in George Bellow's Shower Bath from 1917, also in the exhibition, only one figure in the central male couple, right, is queer. And he's composed of every available stereotype of homosexuality, from his leering grin to his hand on his hip to his buttocks thrust back. But his sexual partner, the stockier man, is coded as normatively male, for he's doing what men do, as his notably starched towel underscores. In short, what mattered, according to this frame of reference, was not the sex of one's partner, but one's own putative sex in the sex act. And significantly, all these definitional issues and conundrums were meaningful largely in a Euro-American cultural context. Throughout most of the rest of the world, same-sex desire was simply accepted, even celebrated as an aspect of human sexuality. That is, of course, until colonialism generalized European prejudices across the globe. Islamic poetry and art, for example, until the middle of the 18th century, almost invariably featured a man addressing the beloved beauty who was always a boy. And this tradition continues in the Muslim former Soviet satellite states, ranging from Afghanistan to Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. I'm showing you Usta Mumin's 1932 rich landowner. In these regions, there is a tradition of wealthy landowners choosing a bachabazi, which is essentially a boy trained in the supposedly female arts of singing, dancing, and of course, seducing men. Often sold by poor families to brokers who would then train the boys and sell them on to affluent landowners, bachabazi are a familiar subject in the arts of this region. And you can see here, right, the female harem behind him and his favored boy just underneath his thigh. But though these men are having sex with boys and young men, since the latter are trained in the female role, they're not seen as male, and thus this is not by local definition at all homosexuality. All these Baroque shifts and definitional problems have, of course, profound consequences for an exhibition addressing the first homosexuals, as the first order of business is to determine what is meant by homosexual in the first place. If this signifies a self-conscious adoption of one pole in a binary sexual identity, then it must necessarily postdate the 1850s, when the original definition of sexual difference, the first stirrings of an inborn and totalizing sexuality, were put forward by the German lawyer Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. Still, even his early taxonomy of sexuality remained entirely gender-based, and he thought of queers as a literal third sex, one in whom a soul of one gender was trapped in the body of the opposite gender. Arguably the world's earliest queer rights advocate, the courageous Ulrich wrote what was likely the first ever coming out letter to his own family, and even more impressively, warning them that he was about to speak to a conference of jurists attempting to win legal reform, knowing full well that he would be shouted down, as indeed he was. Shortly thereafter, he lost his license, was sent to prison, and marked as an enemy of the state. But as he wrote his sister, identifying himself, saying, and this is from the letter, "I can no longer deny it. The Urning," that was his term, "is a species of man-woman." In his definitional schema, the Urning was a kind of psychic hermaphrodite with the body of one sex but the erotic desire of its opposite. While his third sex nomenclature of Urning earned a sizable number of adherents, there were plenty of people who called themselves Urnings at the time, its highbrow etymology proved to be a problem. The question of what to name this emerging species was then solved by another early queer rights advocate, Karl Maria Kerbeni, an Austrian-Hungarian writer who, in disputing the inborn essentialism and minority status of Ulrich's biologized sexuality, instead argued in this 1868 letter to Ulrichs that it was far better to sue for rights on the basis of a universal acceptance of all kinds of erotic desires, rather than pin your hopes on minority status, since, let's be clear, minority status has hardly helped most minorities. Kerbeni argued that everyone, in fact, was capable of both homo and heterosexual desire. They were, as you can see in this photo of his original letter, his own coinages. This is the very first use of those terms. And that neither marked anything like an essentialized or elemental difference. In the end, history did what history does, harvested what it wanted from each advocate. From Ulrich came the notion of a minoritized, essentialized, inborn erotic difference, even if it was no longer characterized as a third sex. And from Kerbeni, the far more self-evident terminology of homosexual, even if that adoption did extreme violence to his argument for the universality of homosexual desire. But in truth, this wasn't Ulrich's or Kerbeni's to decide. In the face of nascent challenges to its hegemony, it was dominant culture that sought to preserve a vision of sexuality uncontaminated by same-sex desire. Both Kerbeni and Ulrich thus danced to a tune called out by dominant culture. And with that, our modern binary division of sexuality into homosexual and heterosexual was born. We can watch the page turn from a pre to post-binary sexuality by attending to the reception of this work, John Singer Sargent's wonderful portrait of W. Graham Robertson from 1894. At the time the work was being completed, sexuality was not yet a significant public issue, though it would become so a year later with the beginning of the Oscar Wilde trials. There's nothing in the painting per se that telegraphs a homosexual identity for neither painter nor subject. But 37 years later, the sitter, Robertson himself, published a memoir that recalled his sessions posing for Sargent in terms so self-evidently queer and frankly campy as to make immediately clear the not-so-secret secret that informs this work. The very model of aestheticist style, Robertson was fantastically wealthy, good-looking, blonde, and thin. Indeed, there's speculation that he may have served as the living prototype of Dorian Gray in Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, but then there are a lot of adherents to that particular model. In Robertson's account of what it was like sitting for the Ardens, Sargent is a model of repression and decorum, an older generation's purposeful and willed forgetting of the very sexual differences that Robertson, a generation or two younger, has gleefully embraced. Robertson was 28 years old when he was asked to pose, having met the artist when he accompanied his own mother during one of her sittings for one of Sargent's bread and butter society portraits. Robertson himself was a painter and a gifted raconteur, and in his narrative of the making of this portrait, published, let's be clear, almost 4 decades later, he does his best to drop as many hints as he possibly can about Sargent's sexuality while still echoing the artist's own reticence. In the process, rather gleefully outing himself, unburdened as he was by these then already musty habits of mind. The book was published in 1931. And Robertson tells us that he arrived at the studio at the duly appointed hour, and Sargent decided to pose him, curiously, in the midst of a hot August summer in a heavy winter coat. With a disingenuous air, Robertson wonders, and I quote from the book, why a very thin boy, I then looked no more than a boy, in a very tight coat should have struck him as a subject worthy of treatment I have never discovered, end quote. Robertson then goes on to narrate how he became faint in the midst of posing. And his tale is so littered with raised eyebrows and campy allusions to homosexuality as to make it actively comic. I'm going to quote. I had been standing for over an hour and saw no reason why I should not go on for another hour, when I became aware of what seemed like a cold wind blowing in my face, accompanied by a curious going at my knees. I tried to ask for a rest, but I found that my lips were frozen stiff and refused to move. Hundreds of years passed. I suppose it was about 20 seconds. Sargent glanced at me. What a hard light there is just now, he remarked, a sort of green. He looked more steadily. Why, it's you, he cried, and seizing me by the collar, rushed me into the street, where he propped me up against the doorpost. It was a pity that Oscar Wilde, who lived opposite, was not looking out his window. The wonderful possibilities of Tite Street were as yet unexhausted. Tite Street was, of course, the famous street in Chelsea where Oscar Wilde lived, and the image of the artist holding the boy up by his fur collar against the doorpost opposite Wilde's home was the visualization of exactly that which Robertson refused to name, but still expected us to understand. Such, I want to argue, is the chief strength of art as a historical archive of sexual difference. By showing, but not saying, it devolves interpretive responsibility onto the viewer, allowing that which is said to nonetheless, that which is not said to nonetheless be understood. And of course, not saying, but merely showing, offer the artist a significant political and social advantage, since any attempt to label the work as definitively homosexual could be met with the incriminating, well, if you think so, then you must, etc. This is the distinction operative between Edouard Louis Dubuff's portrait of Mary Rosalie, called Rosa Bonheur, from 1857, before the word homosexuality was coined, and this work, Lotte Laserstein's In My Studio, also called I Am My Mind, which was completed after. In the Dubuff canvas, Bonheur's famously butch persona, which would become ultimately legal, she would apply for and receive police permission to dress as a man, citing the fact that as an animal painter walking through stables required her to dress mannish in a mannish manner. But here it's merely intimated in her ability to enlist what is, after all, a dangerous bull, that traditional masculinist symbol, as you'll see, her personal attribute. She's practically chucking it under the chin, right? But in every other respect, such as dress, comportment, etc., she is in no way breaking with Victorian constructs around femininity. But by contrast, Laserstein is figuring an intimate and physical connection between the artist and her favored model and presumed lover, Trot Rosa. Between 1929 and 1930, Laserstein was not only has the ability to inhabit an extant lesbian identification, but to literally picture it. Enabled by a concept of collective identity and buoyed by a larger community, the artist knows she has an audience for her minoritizing self-identification, at minimum an audience that will find themselves echoed in her painting with her lover. But the directness with which Laserstein figures her sexuality is unusual, and most queer artists of the time instead sought out a productive middle ground, crafting images that read as demonstrably queer to a subculture so inclined to view that way, but at the same time capable of passing muster even within the police confines of a municipal art museum. For example, in Henry Scott Tuke's The Critics, painted but 2 years before the Laserstein, the two youths at the shore greeting a friend in the water can be interpreted as either boyish innocence or knowing eroticism, depending on the perspective of the viewer. Tuke's mainstream success testifies to the fact that his pictorial undecidability enabled his broad success. But long before Tuke's carefully multivalent image-making, other European artists were quietly redrawing the parameters of homoerotic image-making. Chief among these was the great Danish neoclassical sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen, who commandeered classical myth to carry homoeroticisms both publicly and privately. His public sculptures seem, well, frankly, very little coded to our post-homosexual eyes, although at the time, absent sexual identity categories, they afforded the pleasures of the flesh without any label save their specific classical citation. What we would class as homoeroticism bubbles up everywhere, even in the public works, such as in the magnificent late Anacreon and Cupid that we have in the exhibition, this one. But in his private drawings, the artist, then himself in his mid-50s, makes the desire latent in the public sculptures much more explicit as a comely young Cupid pleasures the elderly poet. Through his unprecedented modification of familiar Ganymede themes, Thorvaldsen's deeply invested personal manipulations of the classical tradition really come into their own. This tale of Zeus assuming the form of an eagle to swoop down to earth to adopt the beautiful shepherd boy, Ganymede to serve him body and soul, but I think especially body, has long been the favored soul story of many artists. But almost invariably, it is called the rape of Ganymede. And usually it figures, as here in Rubens's famous painting of it, as a youth overpowered by an eagle with not so subtle allusions to his buttocks and the prospect of anal penetration, here, of course, materialized by the quiver of arrows. Now look at Thorvaldsen's version. This time, Ganymede overwhelms the eagle, but still solicitously serves him, their bond wrought not through compulsion, but through a shared sympathy. In an even earlier drawing, Ganymede towers over Zeus, yet cup in hand still serves him, not out of coercion, but out of free will. Thorvaldsen's as yet unnameable and unclassified modifications of the Ganymede myth reached their apogee in the work actually of another artist, a contemporaneous Swiss artist working in England, Henry Fuseli. Fuseli's Ganymede is unusually titled not The Rape of Ganymede, but Heavenly Ganymede. And in that title, it inaugurates a wholly new take on the tale, for now there is nothing of a ravishment about it. Here Zeus isn't in the form of an eagle, isn't notably older, isn't seizing the boy against his will, isn't violent. Ganymede is elevated above Zeus, and even if he is filling Zeus's cup, he is hardly a victim. More to the point, both look lovingly into each other's faces, their arms intertwined in a gesture that suggests mutual support, love, and desire. They're roughly the same age, hell, they even look alike, and their tenderness with one another is palpable. In contrast to Rubens' painting, this one follows the form of a familiar romance in almost every regard, save the gender of its protagonists. I want to call it a homosexual romance, but I can't, since the word would only be coined 40 years after this lithograph was finished. It is the earliest explicitly same-sex love scene in Western art that I have found, in which companionate homosexuality is the norm. All the more remarkable, then, that 34 years after the publication of that lithograph, one James Pratt and John Smith, both married men, were publicly hanged outside Newgate Prison in London for mutual sodomy, the last such capital case in England. So what Fuseli was depicting, for all its heady romance, was quite literally a capital crime at the time. Not so, however, in Lima, Peru. Effectively, the San Francisco instead. Around the same time that Pratt and Smith were hanged in London, male cross-dressing, as you can see here, was uneventfully depicted in Lima. To the early Spanish governors of Peru, the ubiquitous miscegenation of indigenous European and African populations, coupled with, of course, the tropical climate, produced a particularly heady mix that weakened sexuality to the point of its abandonment. sexual morality to the point of its example. And as Peruvian scholar Magali Alegre Henderson has argued, after 1826, when Peru achieved independence from Spain, the representation of gender non-normativity signaled, in part, Peruvian autonomy and independence. From watercolors of men dressed as women to detailed accounts of one Don Juan Jose, who was a celebrated Afro-Peruvian chef who owned a famous food stall in Lima's market and was chosen to cook the elaborate state dinner for Simón Bolívar when he left Peru. Sexual dissidence was integral to Peruvian culture at the time. Don Juan Jose was universally referred to as El Maricón, or the faggot, and yet in the same breath celebrated, not derided, for their important contribution to Peruvian culture. As a grand street scene of 1834 to 1837 underscores, an embodied feminized affect conceived as the material cognate of an internal condition with no impediment to respectful social interaction, even with the elevated society of church, that is, of course, as represented on the left, or higher education, for that is a student in parade dress on the right. In Europe, in the early years following the coining of the term homosexual, the body becomes the site of a key definitional battle over what homosexual actually represents, what it actually is. Two paintings by the same figure, the French artist Gustave Courtois, but from very different periods of his oeuvre, can help us specify the stakes of this defining battle. I'm showing you Courtois' Narcissus from 1872 on the left, and his portrait of Maurice de Riaz in 1907 on the right. They are, I hope to prove, utterly representative of their respective eras, and I could have chosen numerous other examples to make the same point, because in the 35 years that separates them, something powerful happens that is at the core of this exhibition. And it is, I want to argue, an instance of how changing ideas materially changes representation itself, even as representation, of course, also changes ideas. To look at works by queer artists of this period in the last quarter of the 19th century is to be overwhelmed by the number of pictures of adolescents or ephebes, either naked or in strategic dishabille. An ephebe is, of course, the Latinized and anglicized variation of the classical Greek term for a male adolescent about to begin their military training. He was characterized by his relatively soft, even feminized body before adult musculature transformed him. From Bélanger's image of Abel, to Peruvian artist Carlos Pacaflor's academic nudes, to Colombian artist Dionisio Cortez's image of an ephebe resting, the male equivalent of Odalisque's swamp representation at this period. The English artist Tuke's bathing nude boys aboard a sloop follow this model, and it frankly even receives a feminine inflection in Elena Lukmakovskaya's Adolescentia of 1903. There are, in fact, so many images of adolescence by queer artists that I was actively concerned the exhibition would be hit with the stereotypical homophobic charge of representing pederasty. So we began to look into this development and realized that these ubiquitous images of youth were followed in the work of the same artists by their manifest obverse. Images of mature adults acting so stereotypically, in this instance, manly, that bodybuilders became a favored topic. As here in the photo of Maurice de Riaz, France's most celebrated bodybuilder of the day, posing, let's be clear, in Courtois' studio for that portrait. Courtois even shifted his interest to a cis-masculine rural subject, contemplating notably phallic ears of corn in the undated painting. In the intervening 35 years between these two works by Courtois, the ephebe obviously grew into manhood. My point is that the same artists who painted image after image of boys and youth in the last quarter of the 19th century had, by the beginning of the 20th, almost uniformly turned their attention to masculine men. The Russo-German artist Sascha Schneider is perhaps the most emblematic of this shift, The slight ephebic youth that he shows here in his feeling of dependency from 1894 would, in a few short years, mutate into this, right? A classic bodybuilder portrait from 1907. As if mediating between the two types, Schneider's earlier growing strength from 3 years before depicts a muscular older man encouraging an ephebic boy's physical development à la grecque. Around this time, Schneider actually literally decided to turn his atelier into a bodybuilding gym and explicitly offered to train men so that their bodies would come to resemble the bodies he created in his paintings. Here's a photo of his atelier mixing easels and barbells. I mean to suggest that this masculinity, very much like the effeminate quality of the earlier Thebes, has a kind of overwrought and hyperbolic quality, as if realism isn't so much the goal as it is telegraphing a specifically gendered script. These artists aren't just painting men or Thebes, they're seemingly placing scare quotes around this hyped up engendering, telegraphing that they serve double duty as both subject and typology. I don't mean to suggest that queer artists gave up picturing adolescents entirely as they turned to more mature, normatively masculine men. Rather, I'm suggesting that their practice expanded to now include both mature gender normatives and ephebes. And the telling fact is that before the widespread codification of the homosexual as an identity category, mature men simply were not part of the practice. It's a somatic sea change, this, and it tracks a similar shift in language as the old definitions or constructs around same-sex desire gradually morphed into that new reigning term, the homosexual. When the adolescent reigned supreme in the last quarter of the 19th century, that older ontology of same-sex desire derived from the 1860s writings of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs still held sway, and with it, therefore, the elevation of a third sex as the central characteristic of same-sex desire. And Ulrich's notion of this third sex certainly gathered numerous adherents, gratified that their illicit desires could now finally be properly named and analyzed. Not least, as Ulrichs argued that these traits were inborn, he further maintained that they should be decriminalized, as an earning nature was as natural to him as a heterosexual nature was to others. As Arthur Borgled, known as the Countess, wrote in her 1874 autobiography of inhabiting this third sex, and this was written, of course, when she was imprisoned, and what pleasure it is for the eyes, especially the eyes, to devour someone of your own sex with a ravenous hunger of inexplicable, untranslatable looks, end quote. Borgled's published account, written when she was sentenced, right, is the earliest French autobiography of what today we call a genderqueer or trans individual. And in it, she alternates between a male and female framing of selfhood, as if bringing the Urning's twinned identities to life. Thus armed with a new naturalized sex-gender amalgamation, Ulrichs pioneered a liberationist discourse for sexual minorities, even founding the Federation of Urnings, which was arguably even the earliest gay rights organization in the world. Ulrich's central contention that same-sex inclination constituted a kind of third sex was widely supported and became by far the most popular and credible thesis governing same-sex desire, that is, until, importantly, around 1900, when, as we'll see, the representations changed radically and the definitions did as well. My point is that when so many global artists painted adolescent youths, I'm sure you hear Gustave Moreau's Narcissus, I think that has something to do with Ulrich's defining taxonomy. After all, what is an adolescent but the material conjunction of male and female traits? For youth are, as it were, incompletely gendered. Indeed, if the propensity for queer artists to paint adolescents in the last quarter of the 19th century was tied, at least in part, to a designation of same-sex desire as a literal third sex, it was youthful models that offered a realist means of signifying this new category. Since, by definition, an adult member of a third sex was literally unrepresentable, as one's physical appearance did not entail any variation in normative embodiment, adolescents or ephebes alone would become the very figure of this third gender. For they alone betray physical characteristics of both sexes in their transition into adulthood. The only alternative to the adolescent as figure would be an image like this one, Ismael Neri's androgyno. Then when Kerbeni's term, homosexual, rose in prominence and displaced the urning, and thus gender normativity became more normative and the central characteristic of this new homosexual identity, what could be more gender normative than mature adults? As in this work, Louise Breslau's glorious portrait of her partner. Kerbeni's term received a further boost following the sensational case of an army officer who supposedly brutally sexually assaulted a young boy, itself probably a fabrication for political purposes. And the officer had, unfortunately, publicly labeled himself as an urning, and the resulting hysteria caused public opinion to turn decidedly against the term and towards the endorsement of the new paragraph 143, the recent Prussian law against same-sex sexual acts by consenting men. My point is that the shifting fortunes of homosexuality as a word, and more importantly as a concept, are visible in the art of this period, or as I would prefer to have it, if we learn to read works of art contextually, we can see in them a visual history of queer life that is more complete than any documentary record. It was a world almost eradicated by fascism, and that one that had to be invented yet again. For that is our history, to rise yet again, phoenix-like from the ashes anew, each generation inventing new words and new forms for an ancient idea, while always thinking we're the first generation to live a genuinely queer life. Thank you.
I'm just going to open it up to the audience.
Great. I'm going to sit down.
Stephen Jones, Jonathan. Over the decades in Philadelphia, I've come across some non-figurative paintings as well as items and objects which relate to queer history. For instance, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I saw a painting by Buford Delaney, which the curator described as a view from shipboard of the Turkish coast as Buford was on his way to visit James Baldwin in 1966. Or the early 1840s, a newspaper article that talked about a man who was so compelled to show off how pretty he felt that he sashayed down Market Street in a dress and was promptly arrested because it was illegal for a man to dress as a woman at that time. And finally, a professor took us to Independence Hall and showed us a rarely seen wooden dildo from the 18th century that had belonged to a soldier in George Washington's Continental Army. I was wondering what kinds of non-figurative paintings or objects or items have you come across in American culture that relate to a queer history?
Great. Thank you. I mean, not surprisingly, given the historical parameters of the exhibition, which are, it ends in 1939, it's towards the latter end of that period that we see non-figurative emblems begin to emerge as modernism itself becomes more the norm in the history of art. And we see that in works, for example, by Marston Hartley, who it is figurative in that there's a literal thing, but he's interested in the sort of echoes of an object. So he'll paint a pansy in 1928 after the 1926 pansy craze in the United States, which was a brief moment when effeminate men had a place in the sun, but it was not always positive. And so it's actually, as far as I was able to see, the first artist who picked up on the pansy theme and made a pansy portrait. But even that, of course, is an abstracted image of an object. I think the abstract would have to be, again, Marsden Hartley, who as early as 1914 is doing his great German officer paintings. But as we've subsequently discovered, in contradistinction to what I was told in grad school, right, they are all because of his profound relationship to a man with whom he was in love, Karl von Freiberg, an enemy combatant who was moreover a man at the moment that the United States was entering into the First World War on the other side.
Right.
Okay, this is a really simple question, but the painting of Lottie Laserstein's in Meinem Atelier, is a painting of a woman and another painter. Is there also a painting from that painter of the other perspective?
I'm sorry, I'm not following. Say that again?
So the painting of the woman who's laying down and there's the painter in the background painting, is that painting somewhere?
The actual portrait.
The actual portrait of the person who's behind.
Let me translate.
Yeah, so that is Laserstein, is the painter.
But just the portrait.
So she's painting a painting and
Oh, I understand. Okay. Yes, we think, but do not know that it does exist. And it's a self-portrait with cat. It fits the same physical parameters, but we don't know that it's actually the same.
Okay, I was just curious if it was like two directions of the same person.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that very beautiful and very evocative keynote for the symposium. I have a big question for you, which I just invite you to tackle however you like. Someone who contributed to the catalog for the show, I was thinking a lot about the role that art historians have working with the visual and material archive, about the particular kinds of vantage points we get on the history of sexuality working from this archive. And you mentioned that there's inherent ambiguities in representation that can act as a closet, right? I'm wondering if you have anything more to say about working this archive and what art historians in particular have to contribute to the history of sexuality as people who work not with textual things, but with visual material things. Thank you.
I mean, I think the amazing thing is that, as you know, as a contributor to the catalog, right, so many of the contributors to the catalog found new things because they simply thought to ask about this, right? We haven't been asking. And art history, let's not kid ourselves, is tied by umbilical cord of gold to the 1%, to the most conservative forces in our society. It's, as a consequence, still 1955 in the art history. And it is, it just is. And I say that as an art historian, right? And as a consequence, I think one of the things that we have to do is what this exhibition asked its contributors to do, which is to simply ask a range of questions. And when we do, we discover wholly new aspects of the discipline that have not been covered in Jansen, the textbook. And so what I urge art history to do is to leave 1955 behind, right? And to begin to ask relevant questions. But sadly, what I'm seeing happening, and people in the audience can testify to this, is that it's not happening in art history, it's happening in English. That the field of English is moving into art history because we have been stupid and lazy and reinforcing dominant narratives. And what we need to do is challenge that.
I'm gonna move to the back, give some people here back some love.
First of all, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Johnny. thank Alphawood and thank Fred and Brightwood for this beautiful, amazing exhibition. So one question I have many questions, but you ended your talk by reiterating something I've heard you say before, which seems to privilege artistic depictions of what you're talking about, as opposed to linguistic ones, okay, which you find to be not as robust. Let's just put it that way. I've had a couple of cocktails. We all know what that's all about.
We do.
Yeah. So, and I've always taken exception to that. And in the context of your talk tonight, I think about the Graham Robertson portrait and your description of his memoir subsequent to the sitting that he did with Sargent. So we're talking about the confluence, so to speak, of a literary text which explicates this portrait that we probably wouldn't be able to understand without
The text.
the text, right? So,
I'm invalidating my own argument. So I'm invalidating my own argument, which is,
I am.
yeah, you are. So,
No,
I think you're absolutely right.
I'm trying to complexify it.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so that's,
So let me first say that I noticed that, and I was praying that nobody else knew. So damn it. But secondly, because really what I want to say is a political statement. I am trying very hard to urge my field to engage in a way that it hasn't. And the way I do that is by appealing to the field's own sense of vanity, right? That it is the arts that can do this. But I also do genuinely believe, and I will stake to this, right, that the arts represent the largest archive of sexual difference in the world, and it's an archive we haven't plumbed.
okay. And I would still, it would be interesting for me. It would be if I weren't on the home stretch here, I would say I would take that challenge, in terms of literature, and meet you, okay? Because I think there are all the same nuances in terms of literature that mirror what you're doing. Yeah.
And yet I would say this, and I'm looking for your genuine response, that because art need not use the extant linguistic terms, right?
No.
That art has latitude, and it's that latitude that I'm so interested in. What animated this exhibition was the belief that as the language around sexuality became increasingly impoverished, ultimately ending in a binary, homo-hetero, right, it was art that could pick up the slack and engage in all sorts of complex and nuanced ways, forms for which there weren't yet words. Now, I will agree with you that there were plenty of wonderful artists in the literary realm who found words, but I think that there still is perhaps an ease to the representation of these nuanced forms in the arts that isn't found in literature. And I'm happy to dispute this with you.
Okay, later.
We have time for maybe one more
I
question.
just want to add something to that. I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit, Jonathan, and also Johnny, because I think art, as you say, can an image is worth 1,000 words, and by bringing in all of these works together in one place, you can start to pick up and read some of these clues maybe easier than reading through 1,000 books or 350 books from the period. So I think that it says a little bit more than you're giving it credit.
I think there was a hand back there.
Okay, let's just do 2 more. Like, why not?
Okay, whose hand is up around here?
And I'll come back to you guys afterwards.
Thank you.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Thinking along the lines of the visual and the linguistic, one thing that I was really kind of enamored with in the keynote was the tracing of visual masculinity in terms of like the shifts from earning and the third sex and the civic to this kind of bodybuilder figure.
Yeah.
And I'm also was kind of honing in on the dates on the slides at that moment as well. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about kind of like the sexological turn within this and thinking about like how perhaps like psychoanalysis or like the burgeoning field of psychoanalysis contemporaneous to this might influence our understanding of these works as well as that language became co-opted by science even more specifically. And here I'm also thinking about the import of the confessional within this moment and how perhaps that might give us another opportunity to read visually, particularly in terms of like self-portraiture of the genre. And I wonder if you could just kind of talk a little bit more about that perhaps.
Sure. I mean, and this, of course, one thinks immediately of the Countess's confessional account. So many of the earliest surviving accounts are precisely these kind of autobiographical confessional accounts, often written in prison, but not necessarily so, in which figures talk about their identity. But I'm not sure about the psychoanalytic component because we are talking here, these early accounts in the 1870s. Are you seeing psychoanalytic accounts that early?
No, I'm thinking about when you had, like later, we had like 1908 on screen, so like post-Freudian documentation, as opposed to like juxtaposing those in terms of like a pre and post Freudian psychoanalysis.
Yeah. I mean, in this respect, of course, Freud's famous evocation of a kind of universal bisexuality, and like so much in Freud, he contradicts himself, but nonetheless, right, his evocation of this universal bisexuality is, I think, something that sort of animates and pushes forward contemporary understandings, but were I to engage the question of psychoanalysis at this period, I think the scales would definitely not be in its favor, but weighed against these early definitions. No?
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question.
So I was wondering if you came across in curating the show situations where you're working with estates of artists or collections that are kind of not acknowledging the identities of these artists. And I'm thinking of someone like Lord Leighton, who it's just so clear to me that he was gay. But then also, that's me imposing this, 21st century viewpoint back on it. So kind of a two-part question. Do you have any maybe fun stories to end on of that? And then what do you see as a model for kind of responsible scholarship from this 21st century perspective? How should we refer and think about someone like, for example, Lord Leighton?
Well, I'm surprised. I've always used the term latent homosexuality. I thought no, I mean, this is, in fact, one of the issues that we confronted on a regular basis in mounting this exhibition. And there were plenty of artists' estates that wouldn't play ball, as one can well imagine. Of course, the artists in question were no longer with us. It was the families, and the families did not want to have their loved one's name besmirched, which I always found particularly troubling. But it was no more the case than it would be with museums who also refused to play ball because they didn't want X artist's work to be understood as queer. And of course, going into this, we knew by virtue of calling the exhibition The First Homosexuals that this is something we were going to confront. And we thought, well, we can either duck it or confront it. And we decided to confront it because it made the political statement we felt we needed to make. As always in doing these kinds of initial forays into a field, we knew that it was going to be rough. And indeed, I have never done an exhibition which had the rejection rate of loans that this exhibition had, which hovered around 90%. It is a tribute to all our scholars and to Johnny that we were able to mount a really powerful exhibition, given the fact that we only got 10% of the loans we refused. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
I guess just if you have any, how should we be thinking about these artists looking back? You know, is it appropriate for me to be like latent homosexuality? Like, can I claim that upon him?
You know, I've always had a particular beef with contemporary scholarship because I hear the same people who constantly criticize queer historians for using terms like queer in the past freely use the term, like, say, marriage, to describe 9th century formation, a 12th century formation, 16th century formation, and those are completely different social formations. If we're going to be obsessive about the resonances of terms, then let's do it across the board, right? But I find the particular burden that queer studies must uphold a direct attack on our field in a coded manner, and that troubles me.
That's right.
Well, we have to wrap up, so we have time for our Latin American panel, which will commence in about 10 minutes. So everyone take 10 minutes to use the bathroom, get a beverage, have some fruit. It's a little fruity in here.